As previously discussed, the Most Honorable Silis Muhammad is our expert when it comes to human rights, reparations, and obtaining identity for the Afro-descendant man and woman formerly known as African American. He has been dedicated and relentless in his pursuit thereof and has an extensive track record. So let's get into that track record as per the Lost Foundation of Islam Houston website. Silis Muhammad expands his record of achievement in the fight for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery. As a dialogue with the United States President Barack Obama's administration about America's failure to honor its longtime track record in the fight for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for slavery, Houston, Texas, April 9, 2014, Silis Muhammad, the foremost leader in Afro-descendant human rights and reparation, recently informed the black public of his letter to U.S. President Obama, Congress, the Joint Chief of Staff, and the Pope of Rome, outlining the Afro-descendant claim for reparation for slavery, which also growing his long list of achievements in the areas of human rights and reparations. While Mr. Muhammad's letter may interest the black family, it may not be known that Mr. Muhammad's work as a proven worker for Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery goes as far back as 1994. Rashida Tlaib Dean of the Lost Foundation of Islam said that the first time that I heard his separation, reparations, and taxation letter in Chicago, Illinois in 1990 is when I first recognized Mr. Muhammad's quest for Afro-descendant reparations. Mr. Muhammad's abbreviated list of United Nations interventions delivered in advancement of Afro-descendant human rights and reparations for plantation slavery is listed below. So here goes. 1994, petition for reparations to the UN 1503 procedure. Mr. Muhammad delivered a 1503 communication to the UN Working Group on Communications on behalf of African Americans, now called Afro-descendant. 1997, written statement to the UN. Mr. Muhammad recommended opening a forum so that African Americans, Afro-descendant, human rights grievances that form the basis of a petition submitted can be expressed systematically, as well as officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. 1998, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad urged the Commission on Human Rights to assist African Americans, Afro-descendant, in their efforts to recover from the official U.S. policies of enslavement, apartheid, and forced assimilation. Mr. Muhammad prayed that the human rights of African Americans be recaptured politically and amicably. Rights to self-determination rectified and the damages sustained by awarded in great measures in order to accomplish the cathartic cleansing mentally, emotionally, and physically of 400 years of long suffering. Mr. Muhammad prayed that the U.S. government not be given the tacit approval of the UN to subvert the opening of a forum wherein African American grievances can be expressed systematically and officially recorded, evaluated, and remedied. 1999, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad requested recognition of the African American, Afro-descendant, choice of human rights and inalienable rights. He requested the crime of plantation slavery and its lingering effects be rectified, which was and is still a crime against African Americans, Afro-descendants, and against humanity. Mr. Muhammad asked the UN to establish a forum for the purpose of restoring African American human rights, their political being, and their status as a people. Mr. Muhammad urged recommendation that the subcommission pass a resolution recognizing slavery and the slave trade as a crime against humanity. He urged the writing of a working paper as a way to begin analyzing African American situations, Afro-descendant situations. Mr. Muhammad urged African American inclusion, Afro-descendant inclusion, in the Declaration of the Rights of personal belongings to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, or a new declaration be written for African Americans, Afro-descendants. Mr. Muhammad asked the International Labor Organization to look into America's privately owned prisons. Year 2000, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad asked that the U.S. pay reparations to the so-called African Americans, Afro-descendant, since the U.S. cannot restore the mother tongue of Afro-descendants if ever it wanted to. Mr. Muhammad recommended the U.S. to be held liable at the least for the last 51 years, plus the additional years which are needed to resolve this issue. He asked that the UN place a reparation sanction upon America if the identity and language of minorities and peoples are to be preserved. Mr. Muhammad asked that a precise dollar amount be given at a future date, if warranted, and that he stated that he would ask for the release of a number of African American human rights victims who have been unjustly incarcerated in federal and state penitentiaries. Finally, Mr. Muhammad asked that the UN to impose a sanction on the U.S. in the form of exemption from all taxation upon our people for as long as this issue is in the hands of the UN. World Conference Against Racism, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad recommended that the World Conference Against Racism declare a decade to consider the issue of slave descendants, including whether lost found peoples is the term that best identifies slave descendants. Regional seminars for Afro-descendants oral statements. Mr. Muhammad put forth the name Lost Found Peoples as a name in order to gain human rights protections for slave descendants, but the name Afro-descendants was agreed upon by the unanimous consent. 2001 written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad urged UN intervention to protect and assist African American, Afro-descendant leaders with a forum as they seek to determine the damage they have sustained and the means of reparation needed in order to bring them back to life as a people. Mr. Muhammad prayed for reparations for the damage suffered during slavery and asked the Commission on Human Rights to hear the African American demand for the right to choose to reconstitute and reconstruct lost ties, since no international instruments, arbitrations, mechanisms, or laws requiring the recognition of minorities that can restrain ethnic conflict during 2001. Attorney Harriet Abubakar, Mr. Muhammad's wife, asked the working group on minorities to cause minority protection to develop in accord with the African American Afro-descendant needs for 2002 written and oral statements. On behalf of African Americans, Afro-descendant, Mr. Muhammad asked the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights to acknowledge the decision that African Americans, Afro-descendants be recognized as Afro-descendant minorities. Mr. Muhammad also recommended that the Commission on Human Rights pass a resolution requesting that the Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights place African Americans, Afro-descendants on its agenda alongside indigenous peoples and minorities. Mr. Muhammad also put forth a prayer for official recognition of self-chosen collective identity and reparations for African Americans, now known as Afro-descendants. 2003 written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad requested official recognition of new minorities, urged the establishment of an international year for minorities, requested support for the efforts of the Working Group on Minorities, and recommended that the Working Group on Minorities organize a second regional seminar for Afro-descendant minorities. Attorney Abubakar assisted the Working Group on Minorities to validate Afro-descendants' self-chosen identity in the documents and use any other means available to place the fact of the existence of Afrodescendants before the UN and the world. 2004, written in oral statements. Mr. Muhammad called upon the UN to grant Afrodescendants protected collective human rights. Mr. Muhammad also asked that the subcommission to make a commitment to minorities that their interventions will be heard. Mr. Muhammad requested the recognition, protection, and assistance of the Commission on Human Rights and the authorities of the UN. 2005, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad recommended sanctions against all governments that have deprived Afrodescendants for every day Afrodescendants have been so denied human rights. He also requested assistance to Afrodescendants in efforts to have a self-chosen identity recognized and protected by the entire UN and by the governments under which Afrodescendants live. 2006, written and oral statements. Mr. Muhammad requested formal UN recognition of slave descendants' self-chosen name Afrodescendants and requested restoration of slave descendants to the human families of the earth. 2008, oral statement. Mr. Muhammad requested that the UN Working Group on Minorities assist Afrodescendants to establish education for Afrodescendants in their original mother tongue. 2014, open letter to U.S. President Barack Obama. Mr. Muhammad sent a letter to U.S. President Obama, Congress, General Dempsey, and the Pope of Rome requesting reparations for Afro-descendants. I know this video may be a little long and my voice may not be that exciting, but the information included here is very exciting if you understand, if you study and understand what it means for us Afro-descendants across the world and in its entirety. Do your own research and stay abreast on this very, very important and exciting information.